What happens when the richest men in a country stop trusting their own leader with their money? Right now, across Russia, that exact question is being answered in real time, and the answer should genuinely worry the Kremlin. Before we go any further, let's take care of something quickly. Tap that like button, hit subscribe, and if you know someone who follows this war closely but hasn't caught this particular story yet, send it their way right now. This is one of those developments that quietly explains almost everything else happening around it. For years, Russia's wealthiest men lived by an unspoken agreement: stay loyal to the Kremlin, keep your head down, never publicly challenge Putin, and in exchange, you get to keep your empire, your yachts, your foreign properties, and your seat at the table. That agreement is now falling apart in front of everyone watching closely enough to notice. Billions of dollars are quietly leaving Russia every single month, flowing into gold, cryptocurrency, foreign real estate, and private investment funds scattered across the Gulf. This isn't a small, nervous trickle of money. Conservative estimates place unofficial capital outflows in the tens of billions of dollars this year alone. And one broad measure, tracked by Russia's own central bank, revealed something almost hard to believe. Roughly $250 billion left the country in just the first year of the war. Let that number sit for a moment. $250 billion gone in 12 months? That's not the behavior of people who believe in our country's future. That's the behavior of people quietly preparing for the worst outcome imaginable and making sure they're not standing anywhere near it when it arrives. What's driving this exodus isn't only Western sanctions, although sanctions certainly play their part. And the deeper fear now spreading through Russia's business elite is something much closer to home. It's the growing suspicion that Putin himself might eventually come for their fortunes next. Since 2024, Russian prosecutors have sharply ramped up asset seizures, specifically targeting wealthy businessmen who hold foreign passports or maintain meaningful ties abroad, precisely because those are the people most capable of quietly disappearing with their money. The logic from the Kremlin side is simple and cold. If you can leave, you're a flight risk. If you're a flight risk, your assets need locking down before you ever get the chance to move them. That fear deepened sharply after Putin began looking for what officials euphemistically described as voluntary contributions to help fund the ongoing war in Ukraine. At a closed-door meeting back in March, a billionaire named Suleiman Kerimov reportedly floated an idea to the room that Russia's wealthiest businessmen should start making substantial direct payments to the state, specifically to help cover the country's ballooning war expenses. Putin welcomed this proposal with visible enthusiasm, and most analysts watching the situation closely believe Kerimov wasn't really the true architect of that idea at all. He was simply the convenient messenger, delivering something Putin clearly wanted, said out loud, without having to say it himself in front of cameras. The message hidden underneath that proposal was unmistakable to everyone in that room. Any fortune built under this regime can be reclaimed the moment the state decides it needs the money badly enough. Nothing is permanently, securely yours. Everything you own is essentially on loan from the Kremlin, and that loan can be called in at any moment with almost no warning at all. This isn't merely a rhetorical threat either. Russian prosecutors have already clawed back assets worth more than 44 billion euros from private hands, funneling them straight back into state control. We're talking about major agricultural companies, valuable gold mining operations, and even Moscow's own Domodedovo airport, one of the busiest and most visible transportation hubs in the entire country. If an asset that large and that publicly visible can simply be seized, nothing left in private hands feels genuinely safe anymore. So where exactly is all this fleeing money actually going? The destinations tell their own quiet story. Cyprus, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, various African states, Monaco, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Notice the pattern running through that list. These are places offering looser financial oversight, friendlier tax structures, and crucially, enough distance from both Western sanctions regimes and direct Kremlin reach. Dubai, in particular, has become something of a magnet for this kind of capital, with its booming property market and active cryptocurrency exchanges offering exactly the kind of quiet, flexible cross-border movement that nervous Russian money desperately needs right now. It's genuinely no surprise that real estate agents across Dubai have suddenly gotten remarkably fluent in Russian. Now here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. Why is Putin suddenly this desperate for cash in the first place? The answer comes down to fairly simple arithmetic, and the underlying numbers are genuinely staggering once you actually look at them closely. Russia's war chest is steadily emptying out, while the costs of continuing this war keep climbing higher month after month, with no realistic ceiling anywhere in sight. Military spending reached somewhere around 75 billion euros last year alone, which works out to roughly 8% of the entire country's total economic output. Think about that proportion for a moment. Nearly 1 out of every $12 generated across the whole Russian economy last year flowed directly into the war machine instead of hospitals, schools, roads, or pensions. The pace isn't slowing down at all. In the first quarter of this year alone, spending reportedly hit 64 billion euros, consuming almost half of the entire federal budget in just 3 months. Total war-related expenses since the invasion began back in 2022 have now crossed an estimated $581 billion. That is not a number that fits comfortably inside any normal national budget, no matter how large or resource-rich the country happens to be. Meanwhile, the revenue side of Russia's ledger keeps shrinking from multiple directions at once. Oil and gas income, historically the reliable backbone of the entire Russian economy, has been squeezed hard by sanctions, export discounts, higher transport costs, weaker global prices, and repeated Ukrainian strikes against refineries and fuel infrastructure. Budget deficits keep blowing past official government projections, quarter after quarter. Russia's National Wealth Fund, the very reserve specifically built to cushion the country through exactly this kind of extended crisis, has been drained sharply, spent down just to keep the ordinary machinery of government functioning day to day. The Russian stock market tells a similarly grim story from a different angle entirely, suffering its longest sustained decline since 1997, with major Russian companies losing somewhere between 20 and 50% of their total market value. When your own domestic stock market signals this level of sustained distress, it becomes extremely difficult to convince anyone, foreign investor or ordinary citizen, that things remain genuinely under control behind the scenes. Even senior figures inside the Russian government itself are starting to read the writing on the wall clearly. Consider the case of a deputy natural resources minister who was recently dismissed from his post. On the very same day he lost his position, he fled the country entirely, landing in the United States, reportedly out of genuine fear he would be prosecuted for failing to address resource shortages that occurred under his official authority. Think carefully about what that single decision actually reveals. This isn't just wealthy businessmen quietly getting nervous about their offshore accounts anymore. This is someone who was embedded deep inside the government machinery itself. Someone who personally benefited for years from the very system Putin built. And even he calculated that running was safer than staying and waiting to see what happened next. That detail is genuinely significant because it shows this growing unease isn't isolated to a handful of oligarchs simply protecting yacht money in offshore bank accounts. It's actively spreading into the state apparatus itself. People who spent years enriching themselves inside Putin's system are now quietly concluding that staying close to power has become more dangerous than walking away from it entirely. And here's the part that makes this even more precarious for the Kremlin. Even for the businessmen who choose to stay and comply, who pay whatever contribution is demanded of them without complaint, there's no meaningful guarantee of protection in return. Putin can demand money from his oligarchs, but he genuinely cannot shield their companies from the physical consequences of a war he insists on continuing. Take Wildberries, Russia's massive online retail giant, essentially the country's own version of Amazon. After suffering repeated Ukrainian drone strikes against its logistics warehouses inside Russian territory, the company is now actively searching for replacement warehouse space across the border in Kazakhstan instead. It initially tried finding suitable new locations inside Russia itself, but property owners kept refusing to sign leases, genuinely terrified that hosting a Wildberries facility would simply paint a fresh target on their own building for the very next wave of drone strikes. Think carefully about what that actually means for the broader picture. Russian capital isn't only fleeing taxation anymore. It isn't only fleeing the constant risk of state confiscation. It's now fleeing outright physical destruction. The very real, tangible possibility that a warehouse, a factory, or an office building could be reduced to rubble overnight, all because Putin refuses to end a war that keeps turning every corner of the domestic economy into a legitimate military target. Put all of these pieces together, and you get a portrait of Russia's business elite that looks nothing like unshakable, unconditional loyalty. It looks instead like a class of people doing quiet, careful math behind closed doors and arriving at a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Staying loyal to Putin might genuinely cost them everything they've spent decades building. He wants their money, he cannot actually protect their businesses from harm, and he presides over an economy sliding steadily deeper into crisis with no clear, believable path back towards stability. Their collective response has been to move both their assets and, increasingly, themselves out of reach entirely. Every single transfer of wealth abroad functions as a quiet, individual vote of no confidence, not just in Putin's economic management, but in his long-term survival at the top of the entire Russian system. The Kremlin will inevitably frame all of this publicly as betrayal, as disloyalty from men who supposedly owe everything they have to the system Putin personally built and protected for decades. But from the perspective of the oligarchs themselves, there's genuinely no attractive alternative left on the table anymore. When you sense the ship beneath your feet is quietly taking on water, you don't stand around debating questions of loyalty. You start looking for the nearest available lifeboat, and you make absolutely sure you're already on it before someone locks every remaining exit shut. Now let's pause here for a moment, because if you've made it this far into the video, you clearly care about understanding what's genuinely happening inside Russia beyond the surface level headlines most outlets settle for. That's exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built around. If this analysis is giving you a clearer picture than what you're seeing elsewhere online, let me know in the comments what surprised you most so far, the sheer scale of the numbers, the fleeing government minister, or the growing physical danger facing Russian businesses. I genuinely read every single comment, and it directly shapes what we choose to dig into next. These seizures aren't random. They're carefully targeted to send a message to other oligarchs. Roman Abramovich, once one of Putin's closest allies, saw his assets frozen and his British football team confiscated. Oleg Deripaska's aluminum empire faced sanctions that destroyed its international business. Alisher Usmanov's media and technology companies were dismantled by government investigations. The message to other oligarchs was unmistakable. Your loyalty means nothing if Putin needs your money. Your past support provides no protection if the state requires your assets. Your friendship with Putin will not save you if he decides you're expendable. Even more terrifying for the oligarchs is the realization that Putin's protection, which they once considered absolute, no longer exists. Ukrainian drone strikes are reaching deep into Russian territory, targeting the very businesses and infrastructure that oligarchs depend on. Wildberries, Russia's largest online retailer, has been forced to relocate warehouses to Kazakhstan after repeated Ukrainian attacks on its Russian facilities. Property owners are refusing to lease space to major Russian companies because they fear becoming targets for Ukrainian strikes. The physical infrastructure of oligarch wealth is under constant threat, and Putin cannot protect it. The man who promised absolute security in exchange for absolute loyalty can no longer deliver on his most basic promise. This vulnerability extends beyond physical attacks. The oligarchs are discovering that their businesses cannot function in a war. Economy. Supply chains that depended on Western technology and components have been severed. International partnerships that took decades to build have been destroyed overnight. Markets that generated billions in revenue have been closed by sanctions. The most sophisticated Russian companies, which once competed globally, are now struggling to maintain basic operations. Technological sanctions have cut them off from advanced computer chips, software, and manufacturing equipment. Financial sanctions have made international transactions nearly impossible. The business environment that created oligarch fortunes no longer exists. But perhaps most frightening for the oligarchs is the realization that they're not just losing money, they're losing relevance. Putin's war economy is increasingly controlled by the military-industrial complex and the security services. Traditional business leaders are being replaced by generals and intelligence officers who understand weapons production but have no experience with international commerce or financial markets. The oligarchs who once shaped Russian economic policy now find themselves excluded from important decisions. Their advice is ignored, their concerns dismissed, and their expertise considered irrelevant. They're becoming obsolete in Putin's new Russia, and they know it. Government officials are fleeing alongside the oligarchs, proving that the crisis extends far beyond the business community. Denis Bayev, who served as Deputy Natural Resources Minister, fled to the United States on the same day he was dismissed from his position. His departure demonstrates that even senior government officials no longer trust Putin to protect them from prosecution or persecution. Ready for the most shocking part of this story? Like this video if you can't believe how far Putin's support has collapsed. And make sure you're subscribed, because what I'm about to reveal about the oligarchs' escape routes will amaze you. Share this with someone who needs to understand how dictatorships actually fall apart from the inside. The methods oligarchs are using to escape Putin's reach reveal the sophistication of modern financial warfare. Traditional bank transfers, which can be monitored and blocked by both Russian authorities and international sanctions, have been largely abandoned. Instead, Russian billionaires are pioneering new forms of wealth preservation that operate outside conventional financial systems. Cryptocurrency has become the preferred vehicle for large-scale capital flight. Unlike bank deposits, which exist in specific jurisdictions and can be frozen by government action, cryptocurrency exists in a decentralized network that no single authority can control. Russian oligarchs are converting billions of rubles into Bitcoin and Ethereum, then moving those funds through complex blockchain transactions that are extremely difficult to trace. The process typically involves multiple steps designed to obscure the money's origins. Rubles are first converted to cryptocurrency through Russian exchanges. The cryptocurrency is then transferred through a series of digital wallets, often involving privacy-focused coins like Monero that are designed to hide transaction details. Finally, The cryptocurrency is converted back to traditional currency in jurisdictions like the United Arab Emirates or Switzerland, where Russian sanctions don't apply. Real estate has become another crucial escape route, particularly in Dubai and Monaco. These markets have experienced explosive growth in Russian investment, with some properties selling for prices that seem to make no economic sense until you understand they're essentially money laundering operations disguised as real estate purchases. A luxury apartment in Dubai that might normally sell for $5 million is being purchased by Russian buyers for $15 or $20 million. The extra cost is essentially a fee for converting sanctioned Russian wealth into untouchable foreign assets. These properties can later be sold or used as collateral for loans, effectively cleaning the money and making it accessible through the international financial system. Gold has experienced a renaissance among Russian oligarchs seeking to preserve wealth outside the banking system. Unlike cryptocurrency or real estate, gold is a physical asset that retains value regardless of political or economic conditions. Russian buyers are purchasing gold through intermediaries in Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Turkey, then storing it in secure facilities in Switzerland and Singapore. The most sophisticated oligarchs are establishing entire parallel financial ecosystems designed to operate independently of both Russian and Western banking systems. These involve creating networks of shell companies in multiple jurisdictions, establishing trust funds in countries with strict banking secrecy laws, and developing relationships with financial institutions that specialize in serving high net worth individuals from sanctioned countries. Private investment funds in the Gulf states have become particularly important for Russian capital flight. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates maintain friendly relationships with Russia while also participating in the global financial system. This allows them to offer services that essentially launder Russian wealth by mixing it with investments from other countries and making it impossible to trace the original source. The scale of this capital flight is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over $50 billion in Russian wealth has been moved offshore since the war began, but intelligence analysts believe the real number could be 3 times higher. Much of this movement is happening through channels that don't appear in official statistics, making it impossible to track with complete accuracy. What makes this exodus particularly significant is that it's not just about money. It's about the complete breakdown of trust between Putin and the people who built their fortunes supporting his system. These oligarchs aren't just moving money as a financial hedge. They're preparing for the possibility that Putin's regime will collapse entirely. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Putin built his entire political system on the idea that loyalty would be rewarded and disloyalty would be punished. Now he's discovering that even his most loyal supporters will abandon him when their survival is at stake. The oligarch's flight represents a vote of no confidence in Putin's future that is more powerful than any opposition protest or international sanction. Each $1 billion that leaves Russia weakens Putin's regime in multiple ways. It reduces the resources available to fund the war effort. It demonstrates to other potential supporters that aligning with Putin is becoming a losing proposition. It creates financial pressure that forces Putin to make increasingly desperate decisions, and it establishes a foundation for post-Putin Russia that will be controlled by people who have positioned themselves beyond the current regime's reach. The oligarch's escape also reveals the fundamental weakness of authoritarian systems that depend on personal loyalty rather than institutional strength. When a dictator's supporters believe his regime is failing, they don't fight to save it. They position themselves to survive its collapse and profit from whatever comes next. Putin's response to this betrayal has been predictably brutal. Asset seizures have accelerated, with prosecutors targeting anyone suspected of moving money abroad. New laws make it easier to confiscate wealth from people accused of supporting. Gold has experienced a renaissance among Russian oligarchs seeking to preserve wealth outside the banking system. Unlike cryptocurrency or real estate, gold is a physical asset that retains value regardless of political or economic conditions. Russian buyers are purchasing gold through intermediaries in Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Turkey, then storing it in secure facilities in Switzerland and Singapore. The most sophisticated oligarchs are establishing entire parallel financial ecosystems designed to operate independently of both Russian and Western banking systems. These involve creating networks of shell companies in multiple jurisdictions, establishing trust funds in countries with strict banking secrecy laws, and developing relationships with financial institutions that specialize in serving high net worth individuals from sanctioned countries. Private investment funds in the Gulf states have become particularly important for Russian capital flight. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates maintained friendly relationships with Russia while also participating in the global financial system. This allows them to offer services that essentially launder Russian wealth by mixing it with investments from other countries and making it impossible to trace the original source. The scale of this capital flight is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over $50 billion in Russian wealth has been moved offshore since the war began. But intelligence analysts believe the real number could be 3 times higher. Much of this movement is happening through channels that don't appear in official statistics, making it impossible to track with complete accuracy. What makes this exodus particularly significant is that it's not just about money. It's about the complete breakdown of trust between Putin and the people who built their fortunes supporting his system. These oligarchs aren't just moving money as a financial hedge. They're preparing for the possibility that Putin's regime will collapse entirely. The psychological impact of this betrayal cannot be overstated. Putin built his entire political system on the idea that loyalty would be rewarded and disloyalty would be punished. Now he's discovering that even his most loyal supporters will abandon him when their survival is at stake. The oligarch's flight represents a vote of no confidence in Putin's future that is more powerful than any opposition protest or international sanction. Each $1 billion that leaves Russia weakens Putin's regime in multiple ways. It reduces the resources available to fund the war effort. It demonstrates to other potential supporters that aligning with Putin is becoming a losing proposition. It creates financial pressure that forces Putin to make increasingly desperate decisions, and it establishes a foundation for post-Putin Russia that will be controlled by people who have positioned themselves beyond the current regime's reach. The oligarch's escape also reveals the fundamental weakness of authoritarian systems that depend on personal loyalty rather than institutional strength. When a dictator's supporters believe his regime is failing, they don't fight to save it. They position themselves to survive its collapse and profit from whatever comes next. Putin's response to this betrayal has been predictably brutal. Asset seizures have accelerated, with prosecutors targeting anyone suspected of moving money abroad. New laws make it easier to confiscate wealth from people accused of supporting foreign governments or undermining Russian interests. The definition of treason has been expanded to include almost any form of international business activity. But these crackdowns are only accelerating the exodus. Every new seizure convinces other oligarchs that they need to move their money faster. Every new law targeting international business makes it clearer that Putin views the business community as an enemy rather than an ally. The regime's attempts to stop capital flight are creating the very desperation that drives more capital flight. The international implications of Russia's oligarch exodus extend far beyond Russian borders. These billionaires are bringing massive amounts of capital to countries like the UAE, Turkey, and Kazakhstan, potentially destabilizing local economies and creating new forms of international influence. The money that once funded Putin's political machine may now be used to shape politics in other countries. Western intelligence agencies are closely monitoring these wealth transfers, both to enforce sanctions and to understand how Russian influence operations might evolve. If Russian oligarchs establish significant economic power in countries that don't participate in Western sanctions, they could potentially create new channels for circumventing international pressure on Putin's regime. But the most significant implication may be what this exodus reveals about the stability of Putin's system. When the people who built their fortunes supporting a leader begin planning for his downfall, that leader's days are numbered. The oligarch's flight isn't just a response to current pressures, it's preparation for a post-Putin future that they believe is inevitable. The Russian system that Putin built over 2 decades is collapsing from within. The loyalty he bought with wealth and fear is evaporating as his supporters realize that association with his regime has become a liability rather than an asset. The oligarchs who once competed to demonstrate their support for Putin are now competing to distance themselves from him as quickly as possible. The flight of Russia's oligarchs represents more than just a financial crisis. It represents the complete breakdown of the social contract that held Putin's system together. The men who once shared power with Putin are now preparing for a future without him. Their billions of dollars, safely hidden beyond his reach, will determine who controls Russia after Putin falls. The revolution that will bring down Putin's regime isn't happening in the streets of Moscow or on the battlefields of Ukraine. It's happening in the private banking centers of Dubai and the cryptocurrency exchanges of Hong Kong, where Russia's elite are quietly voting with their wallets against the system they once supported. And their vote is clear. Putin's time is over.